This is Asha Dore with Totally Biased Reviews, talking with Joshua Mohr about his book, Saint the Terrifying. The music you just heard came from Size Queens, which is the first single from Slummy, a fictional band from Saint the Terrifying that Joshua Mohr fronts in real life. You can purchase the EP along with the book from Unnamed Press.
And technically, what the Saint Project is a trilogy of novels being published in a year, right? So the first book is called Saint the Terrifying, and it comes out in October. The second one is called The Wolf Wants Answers, and it's out April 25. And then the culminating piece of the cycle will be called Let's All Laugh Like Killers, which will be out October 25. So from my publisher's perspective, this is kind of three sovereign works of art that are having a conversation together. From my perspective, this is just one serialized wild arc. I was really thinking about how, back in the day, they would serialize things in the newspaper. Like you think about Dickens, right? Where he was always trying to, leave things at the most juicy place in a text that, he possibly could. And, to kind of make that the hunger and the appetite for the audience. And then he would start to tell the next dollop of the story. So that was sort of the scaffolding of the project. And then, of course, for me, a book is always about its characters and not necessarily about plot. Plot is a very fungible thing. So this project started with a person, this guy named Saint. I was just laughing to myself, thinking about, what if Johnny Rotten had a baby with The Rock? Like that's very interesting to me as somebody who's like a badass is badass, but as a punk rocker, I mean, I want to talk about the things that I love in my bones. I think post-COVID, we're living in this era of zero fucks art. Like if you're not making the exact art that you want to make, I don't think you're really paying attention to the stakes of the world right now. So I wanted to write this hybrid that celebrates punk rock, this thing that has meant the world to me over the years, but also tell the story of this kind of badass is badass. I'm Norwegian, and I'm one of those American mutts who didn't know anything about their heritage. During COVID, I took my daughter to the Nordic Museum in the Ballard section of Seattle to just learn more about the Vikings. And she and I just started to talk about it. And it started to burrow into me. And I read like 30 Icelandic Viking sagas. And it was so fun because, it was crime, it was horror, it was fantasy, it was surrealism. Like they were writing these fucking magical narratives 1,000 years ago, right? It was like, I want to do something like that. I want to do something that's that outlandish. I want to do something that's that audacious. And I want to do it through this aesthetic lens where on the line level, it sounds like a punk song. So that was sort of the idea is I wanted to fuse these things that I love together. So in the same structure, though, I also wanted to have some variance. So the first book, Saint the Terrifying, is really a crime story. Saint is playing in this local band and uncovers this local crime ring that's stealing gear from bands. And that is a trespass that Saint is not going to allow to continue. So, he's one of those kind of guys that you would say is a descendant of some of like Sergio Leone's characters in those cool spaghetti westerns, right? Like the anti-hero gunslinger, but who lives by a code, right? And his morality, as backward and violent as that morality might be, is the spine of the story, right? When we're watching somebody do the wrong things for the right reasons, it's a fucking blast to read. And it allows the story to go to some really dark places. But if I've done my job right, like we're laughing our asses off the entire time. What's funny about it is that I didn't write this record to put this record out. And this is what I love about this story is it came from a place of earnest and authentic exploration. I knew I was writing a book about somebody who sings in a band called Slummy. And I felt like the only way I could really understand, because there are so many different types of punk rock, I really needed to write some songs from his perspective. Like, I'm a failed musician. Like, I've been writing songs my whole life. I was singing in awful bands all the way back in junior high school and never stopped writing music. And so I wrote a couple songs just so I could figure out like what mattered to him, what he would sing about, the kind of riffs he would write. So this was a total exercise in persona. I was technically writing the music, but I was really just channeling Saint. So when I was talking to the publisher about it, I just mentioned it offhandedly to him. Oh, I wrote a couple songs. He was like, send one to me. So I popped him an MP3 and he was like, dude, if I pay for you to go into the recording studio, can we make a record? And I was like, fuck yeah, we can make a record. So there's a band in LA that I really love called Movie Club. It's a husband and wife team. The drummer is named Jessamine and the guitarist is named Vince. So I asked them if they wanted to go into the studio to do this with me, to have some fun. My best friend up in Seattle is a music producer, does all the cool Thunder Pussy. He did Pearl Jam's Gigaton. And since I'm the godfather of his daughter, I was like, hey man, you're doing this with me and I'm not going to pay you a fucking dollar. And so we flew down to LA and met the band. And we had a great time. We laid down 5 songs. They're actually pressing vinyl to come out the same day that the book comes out, which is really, really exciting. So you'll have the opportunity to buy the vinyl and the novel at the same time. So it's just there's a really cool conversation happening between the record and the book. And then when I'm on tour this fall, um, we'll play the whole record at the book events. So the opening night will be October 22nd at the Makeout Room in San Francisco. And we'll play the record. I'll read from the book, and we're just going to have some silly goose good times. I just love the idea about how postmodern you want to be, whereas like I'm inviting the question like where does the real world stop, right? And where does sort of the play and the whimsy begin, so like you don't need to know anything about the book, to listen to the record, and you don't need to know anything about the record to read the book. If you do interact with both, artifacts, I think it really unlocks the world in a really, really interesting way. And then when the third book comes out the following October, we'll put out the second half of the record. So when it's all said and done, we'll have an LP and then, the entire 1,000-page Viking saga, as it were.
That's so awesome. Are you familiar with the Pensacola punk community? Have you?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so I grew up there, and like I lived
Oh,
in
cool.
9 for a minute before the Hurricane Ivan came and destroyed it. As I was reading this, I was thinking a lot about how, most people aren't familiar with this world. And when they think
Yep.
about punk music, they think about they think about Green Day and the Clash and stuff like that, but they don't think about like Conflict or Bad Brains or Black Flag, like, or Against Me or any of these bands that like, started making drums out of like newspapers and shit like that. So it's just like
Totally.
so cool to have actual music that you can, like know what you're reading about.
One of the raw materials that I think novelists certainly can overlook sometimes is the culture component. Like, yeah, right. You could talk about like somebody's infected piercing. You could talk about a punk house, from the outside looking in. But culturally, you won't really know what it feels like. We can always tell when somebody's a tourist, regardless of what culture or subculture we happen to be talking about. And this is how I came up. I moved to San Francisco at 17. Like I moved in with a bunch of dirt bags. It didn't start out as a punk house, but fuck was it ever one in about 6 months. It was like punks continued to like metastasize in various rooms of the house. And, there's that undeniable quest to be seen, right? Where most people come to punk houses from places where they're not welcome. Like they're too weird, they're too queer, they're too other for whatever ecosystem they came up And so, our literal families have rejected us, and we build these kind of vibrant and certainly flawed, but still very beautiful found families where all these broken toys get together and you can feel that fury. Like, that's one thing I miss about being in my teens and 20s is just how mad I was. Like, I'm glad on one hand I'm not that bad anymore, but I sort of really miss that ire. There's something kind of romantic about being in that mindset. So I wanted to write this from not from someone who's looking at a punk house like it's a fucking cage at the zoo, but from somebody who's actually like slipped in the skin and lived this life. The other thing about this particular book, Saint the Terrifying, that I'm the most excited about is it's a project of reclamation. There was a tragedy in the Bay Area a few years ago, the ghost ship tragedy. It wasn't technically a punk house. It was just sort of like a big artist live work space where a bunch of people got trapped at an event and burned to death. And I love projects of revisionist history, assuming that they're emanating from the place of reclamation and not exploitation. Like, I'm not trying to capitalize on these people dying. I wanted to figure out a way, kind of like Quentin Tarantino did in, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that we could revisit a historical event. But maybe if I add a new character into the alchemy, these people who perished, maybe they're going to get out alive. And if they get out alive and we get to live that in the book, well, then they get to live forever. And that's what I want from this. The journalists who covered the ghost ship tragedy for the East Bay Express won the Pulitzer Prize for it. So I leaned a lot on their research as I was trying to bring this to life in the most kind of respectful, but also dynamic way that I possibly could. So while I wanted to be, free and making kind of crazy Viking-like decisions, at its core, like, this is a very emotional story. Are we laughing our asses off? Yeah. Is it dirty? Sure. Is it violent? Uh-huh. Is there a mean streak when there needs to be a mean streak? Yes. But the thing that matters the most to me about being a storyteller is to make somebody fucking feel. Like, I want to make you feel in this book, the same way a punk song is going to make you feel. And if I accomplish that, it'll make me smile from ear to ear.
Like underlining it with my little iPhone marker is
Oh,
all of
cool.
the references to like joy and seeking joy and the parallel of like addiction and joy and like the fight and joy. And I can really relate to that. I've always felt that thing you were talking about where the punk community brings in like misfits from everywhere, like people who are just escaping or running away or who felt discarded or have been discarded.
Right.
They're just kind of trying to recreate autonomy,
Yeah,
and
sure.
find that joy, but like admitting that I think is very difficult in those spaces. Sometimes in certain ways, I think that that occurred in my experience, but most of the time it's sort of like relying on the grit and just like we have this shared grit and the unspoken
Yeah,
joy of that and family that's inside of that and vulnerability there. And I think
certainly.
that that really showed through. And I was so impressed with that because it's rare. It's rare to see that about that community.
Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, I'm glad to see, Kamala Harris's campaign getting in on the word joy, because I've been living this in Viking language, they would call it wunju, Wunjo, which is another riff in the book. And what's really important to me about, front loading joy, especially in Saint's set of circumstances, is because he's a convict, and I've volunteered at halfway houses for a really, really long time, sort of dealing with, incarcerated people. That's a population I feel a tremendous empathy stash for obvious reasons, like with just a couple other life decisions, I would have been one of them. And so because I've spent a lot of times around convicts, I sort of know that is it a mind fuck getting out? It is, but that burst of very confused joy where you're just allowed to do anything that you want. So Saint's only, a year off a pretty big stretch in San Quentin. but he has to do the right thing, right? He has to do the thing that he feels called to do. So he's going to commit a bunch of felonies. So the stakes are as high as they could possibly be for him. And yet this is slaking something for him. Like he wants to live this sort of joyous, raucous, anarchical life. And how do you do that? There's a riff that runs through the entire book about Whole Foods. And it presents it as kind of a binary at first, right? Like he can either be a Viking or he can be a Whole Foods. He can be completely rehabilitated, right? Or he's completely unrehabilitatable. And by the time, we get to the end of the story, maybe it's not quite a binary. Maybe there's a way for those things to sort of coexist in the human heart. That's certainly one of the things that the books wants to explore.
Yeah, I love how there's categorization of people and like how much Whole Foods or Green Day they have inside of them throughout the
Right.
book. That is
I mean,
hilarious.
I felt bad about like how much I was crawling up Green Day's ass in the book. It makes it sound like I've got an axe to grind against them. Like I have no problem with Green Day's music, but Saint would have a problem with Green Day's
Right.
music. So it was really fun to like turn myself loose to be as snobby as I want to be about pop punk, because that wouldn't be my first genre that I would gravitate toward.
I was like cracking up. That was like my laugh out loud were the Green Day
Oh,
sticky.
good.
Very funny.
Yeah, I mean, I always feel like the usually the best parts of a book are when the novelist herself is just having an absolute fucking blast.
Mhm.
And when I'm ragging on Green Day or making fun of Third Eye Blind or talking about Eddie Murphy's hit song Boogie in Your Butt, like I'm just at the computer just like smiling from ear to ear.
I bet. I bet. It's funny because Green Day's on tour right now and like all of these like former like hardcore crusty punks are posting on social media, you know,
Yep.
at the Green Day shows. And it's like,
Crazy. I mean, to see them at, playing Fenway, with Rancid, and you're just like, what? Like, I used to see Green Day and Rancid when I was in high school. I went to high school in the East Bay.
mhm,
And so 924 Gilman Street was right there in Berkeley. And we'd see Green Day for $3. We'd see Rancid for $3, Mr. T Experience, Tilt, Crib Shrine, like on and on and on and on. And it was just like, that's what we did.
yeah.
And it became this kind of secular church for us. Again, to go back to this idea of the found family,
Mhm.
like we were all broken toys. And then all of a sudden there was the music,
Yeah.
right? Suddenly Jawbreakers up on stage. And I didn't get to see Up Ivy, right? But like their shadow was over the entire festivities. Like they changed the punk rock world right in that room. And
Yeah.
you can feel that kind of heat. It's visceral. It has kinetic energy to it. And so you walk in those sorts of, spiritual places and you're like, I can feel the Lord in here.
Yeah. It's really real. I've been thinking a lot about this lately, so it was really like a good time to read your book. I was a Florida punk, so Against Me was like our music,
Sure.
right? Like there
Yeah.
were a couple other bands, but I think that they're the ones that got the most big and have stayed kind of big in a weird way. I remember when they would play, everyone would rush the stage and be singing along, and it was just like so amazing. And then they became sort of famous, and I by the time they got famous, I had left Florida and the punk scene. Like I moved to the Atlanta punk scene and then left
Right.
like was like fuck all of everyone.
Right.
Mostly because of like the crime and the meth that I,
Oh, the speed. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it just changed things a lot when
Sure.
traveling
Yep.
kids were like on meth, really
Yep.
different vibes. But to just like thinking about how, those spaces were so different than any other space I could ever explain. And like when I show people Against Me's music now, they don't feel it. Like I can tell that they're like, okay, I mean, this is like punk music, like, okay, fine, it's folky, punk, whatever. But they are not, they don't know, like you have to be in the real life room of it, I think, to really get it. And I think that it's really cool to try to invite people into that story and that space because
Yeah.
it's so unique. Like, I don't know that there are many other spaces that are so hard to show, you know.
Well, I would argue too that one of the great dichotomies of literature is that the only way you can say something about kind of humankind with capital H is by being as precise as you can with one sort of nuanced, idiosyncratic, and very flawed human heart. Right. So the more closely and intimately you render your main character or your main characters, depending on the strategy of the book, that very singular fingerprint will then allow that person to be in conversation, will allow you to say something far greater than yourself, right? Like if I came on stage and was started waxing about humankind, my audience would lean over and puke all over the fucking floor, right? But if I do it through the lens of, telling Saint's story as precisely as I can, then suddenly it can mean something much more about like our hunt and our quest to figure out who we are and what we want to do with our very short time on this planet. And Saint wants to play guitar, and Saint wants to right some wrongs, and Saint wants to not go back to jail, but he doesn't know how to get out of his own way. Right. So this idea about either, Whole Foods or the penitentiary, is very real for him as he continues to make, you know, a gaggle of bad decisions, again, for the right reasons. Maybe, if you agree with how he's approaching these things, but if 10 people read the book, I want them to have 10 different interpretations of Saint. I'm never looking for consensus, right? Like that's thoroughly didactic for me to sort of tell you how to read my characters. Like I want to put them on the stage in the most warts and all way, bring them to that, strengths and weaknesses alive life, if that's a thing, and let the audience sift through all that and draw her own conclusions.
At first I was like, oh, I like know this guy. Like this is one of those guys that I would probably never have talked to. Because because he does seem to be terrifying. Like he
Yeah,
earns the name.
yeah,
Um, but also like, now that I'm an adult and I work with adults, basic education and adults with disabilities, you can see like how much heart there is in a character like that. So he's a tough one, right? Because he does things that like where you're just like, holy shit, like, nope, that's a nope, don't do that.
well, I love, and I'm certainly in literature, but just, we can extrapolate that out just to life in general. Like I love the prodigals. I love those of us where it just takes a little bit longer to love us.
Mhm.
Where one of the things I have taped up on my office wall when I'm writing stories is the phrase, the dignity of complexity. Which is aesthetically and stylistically something that's really important to me as a novelist. Like, all I want to do is give you access to several different emotional components, right? It's almost like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, or maybe a better way to say it is tiles in a mosaic. And then the audience gets to sort of arrange them in whatever way, she wants to do. And if I've done my job right, by the time the book is over, or certainly the trilogy's over, she'll be able to stand back and say, like, I wouldn't do the things that Saint's doing in this book, but like I kind of understand why he's doing what he's doing, right? Which is this kind of the tenets of psychological realism. We don't have to agree, but we have to understand what's motivating them. And if what's motivating them has that sort of, code behind it, we'll go to some really interesting places with characters. We'll give them that necessary latitude for, shall we say, creative problem solving.
The best euphemism ever. For some of the things he does. Is he the protagonist of all three books in the trilogy?
Yeah. So, each book is self-contained, but they're also building on one another. And I wanted to write them also in different modes. I love to keep my audience on her heels. Like I never want them to know what's coming next.
Mhm.
And so sometimes that means, how I'm constructing scenes or how I'm manipulating time. But it also means like making sure that I'm changing genre just a little bit, right? So the first book I thought of as a more kind of traditional, and put that word in fucking quotation marks, a traditional crime book.
Mhm.
Uh, the second one is a road trip story through the surreal American Southwest. The third book, crazily enough, is set exclusively on a riverboat in China. And now, after reading book one, you're like, well, how the hell does that happen? And like, I ain't gonna tell you.
Yeah, that's
You
awesome.
gotta just enjoy the ride, right? What's cool is this actually happened to a friend of mine. She played in a kind of a really fun indie band, and 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 there was a cruise line in China who had dissembled an actual Mississippi riverboat, reconstructed it over there so they could sort of feature American bands. And when she told me this story, it wasn't in China for her, it was in Japan, but I had to move it for the logic and the reality of the book.
Mhm.
I just always, she told me that 10 years ago. And like that always stuck with me. Like, that's so fucking strange. Like, what would that be like to actually be like, they're not a punk band, but like sort of a rock and roll band, like living on a riverboat. Anyways, it just, that really struck with me. And so the novel itself has nothing to do with what she and her band endured, of course. I just loved that setting and that circumstance just felt great. As a novelist, I love confined settings. Confined settings are gold for us.
Mhm.
Whether it's, Ridley Scott's Spaceship and Alien, or John Carpenter's Outpost and The Thing, and what a snowy wherever the fuck they were. They're not going to get off the riverboat the entire novel, so it's going to be really fun.
That is so fun. Yeah, I was really impressed with how everything happens in like one day in the
Yeah,
novel. It's like really like just exploding the
yeah.
moments like over and over again. It's really great.
Each book has a really compressed timeline. All three books happen within like 2 months, so it's like a season or seasons of television for sure.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of like True Blood, like how everything
Absolutely.
two seasons happens in like a couple of days or something.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
the Saint the Terrifying, what I also love about it is, I don't think I've been able to say this about any of my other novels. Like, I love the backstory too. Like, I had so much fun writing the sections when he's in Norway with his dad, uh, in Arizona with his biological mom, and then finally the final beat of the bad parent triptych was when he was living with his aunt in the Lower Haight and SF. I just had so much fun really figuring out where he came from, all of the life events that have influenced the version of him that we're interacting with in the present, and trying to bring his history to that same kind of like dynamic life. Sometimes when you're reading a book, every time we go to backstory, you're like, oh, fucking kill me. This is so boring right now.
Mhm.
But I've been reading a lot. I've been doing a lot of events this summer, and I've been reading a lot of these backstory sections, and like people really, really seem to lean into it.
Mhm. I mean, it's really like as epic as what's happening in the present of the book.
Great,
It's
great,
very
great,
like,
great.
active and I think that like it really contributes to that the reading of the character as like, well, actually he's kind of mild given his backstory. Like
Right.
like you would expect him to not be as like sort of love driven. I was thinking when you were talking about the boat in China setting, I just went to Disneyland with my kids for the first time this year and like saw the like New Orleans. Have you been to
Oh
Disneyland?
yeah, 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 totally.
Yeah, and like so I'm from Pensacola, which is and I went to New Orleans a lot. My dad was like a drug smuggler through the port of New Orleans. So like I like
Nice.
spent a lot of time in New Orleans. He like called it his real hometown or whatever. You know, boomers. Um, but going there and seeing these like old-timey bands come and play with the boat that's kind of like one of those river boats ride around and they talk in like a southern accent and it's nothing like the South. It's
Right,
nothing at all. It's like
right.
grotesquely not real in like this lame way that like of course I don't want them to have like all of the horrible things that I grew up with in Disneyland, but it's also like my kids are like, oh, I want to go to New Orleans now. And
Right.
like, well, we will, and you'll see, you know.
Must be just like Disneyland, right, Mom?
Yeah, and so I find it so interesting to think of like a punk band on a on a river by boat in China that's kind of trying to like it's not, I mean it's like a way of Disneyfying
Oh,
another.
it is. It absolutely is Disneyfying it, and like it drives Saint as crazy as you think it would drive Saint, especially because it's like a punk rock riverboat, right? Where there's like all the people that work there are dressed like old punks, right? Like there's, of course, there Billy Joe is there, and there's Joey Ramone over here, and Donita Sparks is hanging out over here. So I've already mentioned Tarantino, but I'm going to mention it one more time, especially in terms of the setting, because I was really thinking about Jackrabbit Slims from Pulp Fiction, right? Where all the like movie star impersonators are the wait staff, but I just wanted to use a bunch of old punks. And Sane is furious that they've Disneyfied, these things that he loves so much.
I bet. I mean, I would like actually like to go to that riverboat.
Yeah, me too. Maybe we should start it.
I feel like I mean, especially like in Seattle, people would be like, "Oh my God,
Right.
it's
Well, and the nice thing is it's all tagged up. Like
yeah."
they made it look like super shitty on the outside. It's haunting in that sense too, right? Where what had been like somebody's status quo has now been, turned into some sort of commodity. Like this was like the blood in my veins, right? And now all of a sudden it's frozen in time in this way. Like, you want to see like the flattering part of that. Like, oh, cool. Like I'm glad that like we're becoming more a part of a mainstream conversation. But then you're also like, but now we're a part of a mainstream conversation. And is that okay? Are we allowed to do that?
Like that's where I relate to Saint, where it's just like this was a fight. Like this
Yeah.
was not we but now you guys just come in here and you like pay to like experience to like tour, like you said, like tour,
Oh, you're gonna love book
fought for.
three. If
Yeah.
this bothers you, you're gonna love book three, right? Especially because, in the gift shop, you can buy like a bald cap with like Tim Armstrong's tattoos to put on your head, and you can buy a plastic Liberty spiked mohawk. And so Sane is just walking around fucking furious with all these posers.
I like it's like I love hate that. Like it's like I want that to exist as much as it would like fuck with my head.
Yeah, totally. We'll love to know too that the punk rock riverboat is called the Minor Threat. So that
Oh
should
my
just like
God.
that
That
should
is
make you feel good, right?
yes, yes. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited. This sounds like such a fun project.
The drummer in the band, Jessamine, she's also a really talented videographer. So she made a video for our first single, Size Queens. And the way she was able to bring that song to life, it looks incredible. I can't wait to share this with people. I'm a big advocate of like, when you're trying to lead a project, you just want to put the most talented people that you can possibly find in a room and just shut the fuck up and let them be talented. And she just absolutely knocked it out of the park. So I'm so excited to share all this with people. Yeah.
Is the Saint the Terrifying series something that you would want to make into something
Yes.
stable?
Yeah.
You hoping
Over
to
the last, I've sold 3 shows over the last, I think, 4 or 5 years. We sold one to AMC, sold one to ITV, and then this one to Amblin. But yes, like the trilogy will be, if I get my way, 3 seasons of television for sure.
That's awesome. I think that this would like really lend itself to DV. And it's like I feel like I'd have the same experience watching it as like going into the riverboat thing.
Well, we need like it's such an interesting world, and the nice thing about TV is it allows you to be voyeurs into subcultures that outwardly you'd be like, that's a little scary to me.
Mhm.
Like I don't think I want to go in that world. It's jagged, it's mangled, it can be mean.
Mhm.
That's true, but the biggest loves of my life have come from walking into those scary places,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? Like having the audacity to, form this familial circle pit right? Or like we might be slamming into each other, but if one of us falls down, we're gonna pick that motherfucker up.
Yeah.
And I think that's the punk rock ethos that means the most to me. This idea that like no matter how low you have gone or will go, like there are people there who are gonna fucking pick you up. And like if that's not what this moment that we're living through right now and what I like to call death rattle capitalism, like where so many people are falling through the cracks. We're living through this sort of bare knuckle, economy right now. And so I think the love that you find in these sorts of environments is more poignant than ever because everybody seems to have an ulterior motive right now. Everybody seems to be trying to sell you something from their fucking existential Etsy store.
Mhm.
And now all of a sudden to tell a story of like earnest love,
Mhm.
love that's hard as wood, love that will punch you in the face if it needs to, but
Mhm.
love that will also, pick you up and put you in the shower and take care of you as well.
Mhm.
That's the juxtaposition that really interests me.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too. I really love how Saint like talks about who needs to be taken care of in what moment.
Yeah,
I feel like something that I really cherish from being in like the punk community for a while is like when I lived with my best friend in our punk house. That again, like yours, didn't start as a punk house, but
you never do.
yeah. Just takes one can of spray paint and some like drunk people. Um, but we had this way of like dividing labor. Like if I was working a whole lot that one week, she would do like all the house cleaning. We
Right.
didn't have to talk about it. This way of kind of like evaluating a moment and seeing who needs help and like how can we help that person who needs to have their ass kicked and being kind of okay with kicking people's ass for bad behavior. It just makes things easier. And it's really hard to make happen in other communities. Like I've not seen that happen anywhere else. And I think that really shows in Saint, like this urge to like evaluate who needs care and who needs to be like destroyed in a moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think I know if whatever fire that you've walked through in life, like I'm an old ex-junkie, right? Where like I have a trail of fire behind me, like everybody who's alive has a trail of fire behind you. But what do you do with that? How do you live a life in the present tense that's not gonna be weighed down by the mistakes, but that those kind of reservoir of mistakes have sort of given you the wisdom to try to be on the sunny side of the street in whatever capacity that means to you. Like Saint's working very hard to stay sober, and that's admirable on one hand. And then on the other hand, you're like, well, we should also talk about your unhinged behavior, sir, because you're doing some things that I don't think you're supposed to be doing. Like, you probably shouldn't bite off your best friend's finger, right? But like, he does that halfway through the book. He like he runs into a burning building during the book. He's making, and even in the first chapter where you and I met, and I read that piece out loud, like he plucks his fake eye out of his head and gives it to a guy to eat. And he calls it filthy communion because he feels like it's going to help this guy live a better life. And maybe that's a beautiful moment from Saint's perspective, but also from the audience's perspective, you're like, you did what now? What just happened?
And like, is this guy going to be okay with this eye and his
Right. Right. So it's a really interesting thing to like, load it up. We're right back to culture. Try to tell this story in the most realized way, not from the outside of the punk house in, but from the inside of the punk house out. But it's inviting, it's fast, it's fun, it's prurient. Hopefully it's a little bit smart. And we can just have some laughs along the way together.
I like listened to the book Dope Sick recently,
Oh,
which is
nice.
kind of a I don't know if you've read it or listened to it, but it's
Of
like a
course, yeah.
hard one. Yeah. She talks a lot about the liminal space when somebody is getting clean or getting clean or whatever. And it feels like this book shows that using this subculture too to just kind of show like the violence of that liminal space, both internally and externally, I think is
Yeah.
really interesting.
Well, I like to write into the things that don't necessarily make sense to a character. Uh, I was at a writing conference one time and heard Paul Harding give a lecture in which he said, write what you know, but never write what you understand. So I'm always trying to write into that, whatever confuses that particular character. Like my book right before this was a memoir called Model Citizen. And they marketed it as an addiction memoir, but I never thought about it like that. I thought about it as a relapse memoir. And I wanted to let the audience be privy to the crazy and dynamic, malfunctions that happen in a human heart when every day you wake up and all you want to do is every single drug that exists. But also the other thing you want to do is not do any of those drugs. So like, I want to do drugs, I don't want to do drugs, and they're just fucking fighting in you the entire time. I don't want to tell you about that. Who cares about facts? I
Mhm.
want to make you emotionally experience that volatility. I want to thrust you into the complexities of living in that kind of visceral space. And Saint is a perfect vehicle to do that because he's very strong in his decision making, but he's also wrong a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But if you like him enough, right, you're sort of watching through your fingers like it's a horror movie. Like, no,
Mhm.
get out of your own way, man. When are you ever going to learn how to get out of your own way? And he would say, well, I will as soon as people don't need my help.
Mhm.
And there's something admirable about that kind of self-destruction, right?
I super agree. Yep, that was definitely the experience for me. It's just like,
Oh,
dude,
cool.
don't fuck it up worse. Like, don't make it worse.
Right. Right.
Um, and it's really nice. And I really like your memoir too. I think it's awesome and people should read that. I have a family, lots and lots of people who have struggled with addiction and stuff. And my cousin, who was a lot older than me, must have been like 15 or 20 years older than me. He was just one of those like really, really beautiful, heartfelt people, like extraordinary musician, blah, 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 and just could not deal with that war, like was just
Yeah,
constantly, even when he was at his like best and clean and present, would just be like, I'm just thinking about how much I want to use
totally.
constantly.
And the
And
longer I'm sober too, it makes me feel so much empathy for people with food issues, right? Where like at least with booze and drugs or gambling or sex, like abstinence is an option if you have a proclivity or an addiction in those directions. I can't imagine what it must be like to have struggles around food and yet have to ingest it every single day to keep yourself alive. Like, what if somebody told me that, like, oh, every morning you're allowed to do like 1/2 inch line of heroin and like, but don't do any more.
yeah,
Just do that. Like, I can't even imagine what that sort of, we were talking about wanting to do drugs, not wanting to do drugs and let that battle wage. But what if you have to have some calories? Like, oh my God, it must be so, so difficult to traverse those circumstances.
that's a really good point. I've like never considered that. That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Is there anything else you want to say about your book or publishing or the press or anything like that?
I've never worked with this publisher before. I did my last book with FSG. I'm doing the trilogy with Unnamed Press, and they have just been such great partners bringing this to life. It's such a congested marketplace right now. Like people are buying less books than ever, so we're all like competing for kind of these marketplace crumbs. And so I love that they're being this nimble in their thinking. Like it's completely outrageous that an independent press is putting a record out, right? So Unnamed is doing the 3 books, and then there's a little record label called Rare Bird who's putting the record out. So it's just really exciting to see them like thinking in a way that isn't just like the traditional thing, like put a book out, wing it at the wall, and hope for the best seems to be the marketing strategy of most major publishers these days. So
Mhm.
it's just nice that they're willing to indulge this crazy idea that I have sort of cooked up here. In fact, the rate of the books was Unnamed's idea, and it's one of the reasons that I really wanted to collaborate with them. When I talked to the guy there, Chris, my editor, I was like, "Hey, what I'd like to do is I'd like to put 3 books out in 3 years." And I was trying to tell him that like I could pull that off, even though it sounded crazy.
Mhm.
Uh, and to his credit, he said, "That's not crazy. The whole thing in a fucking year." Um, and I love being outside of my artistic comfort zone. Like I'm far enough along in my career that I know I can write one book at one time, but there's no proof I can pull this off. And novelists sometimes ask themselves what's at stake for their characters. And of course, I have no problem with that. But I also think we should ask another part of that, which is what's at stake for you as the artist. If you're not outside of your comfort zone, if you're not risking public humiliation, you're on fucking autopilot. And fuck that. Like, I want to be as vulnerable, precariously vulnerable as I can possibly be. So, writing 3 books at the same time, basically, I'm inside the most ambitious thing I've ever done. I'm only halfway through the third one. I don't tell my publisher that. But like, I'm drinking as much coffee as I can. I'm so tired, but I'm having the best time writing these books. I've never been inside something this ambitious. I'll never do it again. It's too much. But man, this has been an exciting year artistically.
I bet that's so cool. And most of your books have come out on independent presses, right?
I started my career publishing with $2 radio, just like absolute rock stars, like they're fighting the good fight every day. I did a couple books with Soft Skull. And then I did my last book with FSG, which would be considered a major label. Um, it didn't work for me. It was too impersonal. What I love about publishing, especially going back to Eric at $2 Radio, is like it was us against the world. It's a fixed game. It's a fixed fight. The haves and the have-nots, and that sort of heat. Like, how are we going to crack into this fucking country club that they don't want us in?
Hmm.
So, when my first book ended up making, Oprah's 10 best of the year with this tiny little house in Brooklyn, I think both Eric and I were like, wait, what? Oh, and then the second one ended up making the editor's choice on the New York Times bestseller list. And we were like, wait, what?
That's
We
awesome.
felt
That's
like we were, in a weird way, hacking the system. So it kind of feels like a full circle moment now to be putting a trilogy out that just is celebrating punk rock, because, ethically and morally, like that's how I've interacted with people my whole life. So it's just nice to now figure out a way how to honor that in Saint's story. I always joke with my grad students that like we're sort of living through this era of art that I would consider beige against the machine. Like
Mhm.
everything sounds like a fucking remix of a fucking remix of a fucking remix.
Mhm.
And I like art that can only be made, can only emanate from that one human imagination. Like
Yeah.
write the song that only you can write, paint the picture only you can paint, write the book that only you can only you can compose.
Mhm.
And I think as long as we're sort of front loading, that audacity, that's
Mhm.
usually when we're cooking with gas artistically. 1996, Phoenix, Arizona. A drunk woman danced on the bar. She had a cast on her wrist. She was, say, in her early 30s. She was, say, feeling no pain. And she screamed at the bartender, "What? You don't believe me? Do you know who I am?" It was the summer, and the TV in the bar plays the Olympics. Right now, showing women's gymnastics live from Atlanta. My mom had broken her wrist a couple days ago, fell in our bathroom, and coincidentally, that was also the day that a female gymnast toppled off the balance beam in the Olympics and broke hers too. My mother never missed an opportunity to capitalize on the misfortunes of others and immediately hatched a plan to drive us to many of our usual haunts, pretending to be the injured gymnast. Even the bartenders that didn't believe her bought her around on the house for originality. And now she was on the bar screaming. There was no mixer in mine. She was all booze, not the faintest light, something so dim that nobody else could even see. She'd get mean. So it didn't make any sense to her why all the other bartenders bought her free drinks. And this guy didn't think he had to because he was what? Special? No one in this world was special, she used to say. So she said to the bartender, right now, do you need to see me perform? And he said, do I need to cut you off again? Meanwhile, I was in the corner drinking 7-Up and playing Miss Pac-Man. I was very good. The game's ghosts were chasing me and I sped through the maze. The Mexican restaurant next door gave me free baskets of chips, and here was my system. Dip a chip in the 7-Up, salt the chip, pop it in my mouth. My mother chewing on something too, yet another perceived slight. And she was giving herself some bad advice, her specialty. And suddenly she took off her heels, and then she used her cast to climb up onto the bar. And the bartender said, stop it, goddammit. But by now she was kicking over the cocktails of the other customers. They were getting wet, getting heated. She was up there having the time of her life. And I dipped a chip, salted it, and sometimes I'd unplug the Miss Pac-Man machine and I'd run over to mom and tell her that something was wrong. I needed her help. And she'd storm over and plug the machine in and tell me to stop being so dumb. And now I dipped and salted a chip, popping it in my mouth. And now I was running away from a red ghost. And my mother was still on the bar and said to the bartender, look, I'm in the Olympics. And she did a cartwheel, not a pretty one, almost falling off, feet slipping because of the spilled drinks. And the bartender said, be careful. And that red ghost gained on me as I sped to a powder pouch, almost there. And the ghost got me. And maybe I needed to unplug the machine right then. Maybe I needed to call over to mom how much I wanted her, how I needed more from her than cans of fruit cocktail and SpaghettiOs, how scary it was when I'd found her twisted up in her own undies and getting dressed, breaking a bone and a gash on her forehead. And she was laughing, laughing, laughing when I found her in the bathroom. And now she was laughing, laughing, laughing on the bar. And she said, where's my gold medal, Wally? And the bartender said, I'll call the cops. And she said, just buy me a drink, you cheap bastard, and I'll come down. And he said, no. And she said, then the show must go on. And I looked at the TV, and they were now showing shots of Olympic Village, all these happy athletes and their smiling families. And they were all there, doing their best. And I was here watching her routine on the bar, a never-ending river of rank fruit cocktail and a moat of SpaghettiOs. And I couldn't stand another second. No. I didn't need to unplug this Miss Pac-Man machine and beg my mother for attention. No. I couldn't make her love me more than liquor. No. We were going to dance on bars forever unless I decided to make my life better. Yes, I needed to flee. Yes, I was gonna get to the Olympic Village now. So I ran out of the bar, down the block. I didn't turn around to see if she came after me. I didn't want to know. That was one thing Miss Pac-Man didn't have to worry about. They were always coming for her. I ran to the nearest intersection and put my thumb out to hitchhike to Atlanta, to Olympic Village, to all those happy families who never drank that sweet piss from their fruit cocktail cans for dessert.
That's not a knife fight. That's not a gunfight. That's a love fight.